Доброго дня.
Greetings, hello.
Всім доброго дня.
Right, so greetings everyone and welcome to our event. My name is Yulia Sporysh. I am the director and founder of NGO Girls. And today we will be presenting the results of a large sociological poll, a survey that we held, which had to do with gender stereotypes and stigmatization. But first of all, I would like to take this opportunity to invite my colleagues, Lyudmila, a PhD and our scientific consultant. Thais represents ActionAid, a partner of ours, from the international side, so to speak. Katerina Shevchenko was heading the field stage, and Ms. Antonyuk heads the analytical department of NGO Girls. It pleases me to see so many of our partners here today, both local and international. I would like to start off by saying a few words about the history of this research and where it came from and why we're so happy to be presenting our results today. So NGO Girls started working in 2016. We focused on sexual education, and this was one of the first things we did. Was we told young girls, adolescent girls, about gender stereotypes, the female physiology, contraception, etc. This is what we started from 7 years ago. Later, as we expanded a little and as we started covering the entirety of Ukraine, including under the Health Without Shame project with UNICEF, we realized that the issue of the stigma around reproductive health and sexual health is so significant that it's actually interfering with us delivering our events and delivering our projects. But this was rather a subjective feeling that we had, and we wanted to run a large-scale research to check whether this hypothesis of ours, whether this feeling of ours is actually corroborated by data. We wanted to look at how conversations in families are held, whether sexual health is under taboo, whether the professional fulfillment of girls and women is not covered by communication in their families. So I initiated this research, but it was rather difficult to run because these surveys are expensive to hold. And back then, in 2021, at the height of COVID, no one seemed to be prepared to fund this study. The idea of the study is nice because we will also be able to track the change in trends. We will be able to run this research over and over every 5 years. So this first wave is the foundation. It sets the baseline. We run it in 2022 during the war. We had 2 stages, quantitative and qualitative. And now every 5 years, we intend to run the research again and to check whether what we are doing, whether all the state programs, whether the international support is contributing to a change in the behaviors of young girls and their parents. So our methodology will be covered in more detail by my colleagues, so I won't dwell on this too much, but I want to mention that as an NGO, which is specialized on sexual education, gender, governance and everything that relates to gender equality and dealing with matters of female involvement in the economy, we will use this data to plan and to develop our further projects. We will also introduce amendments to existing projects. We will be running a large advocacy campaign to require the introduction of sexual education at schools. There's already a petition registered and it has already accrued 25,000 signatures, but what's key here is that the trend is being measured during the war. We all understand what sort of steps back have taken place during the war. Women have prioritized the physical security and safety of their families. They left for abroad. They dropped their careers. They stopped their businesses. And the war has thrown us back in terms of gender advancement. So the baseline is 2022 now, and hopefully in 2027, when we run the numbers again, the results are going to be better, because for me personally, what we have seen in the research is unfortunately quite pessimistic. The patriarchal stereotypes are so strong that there is no noticeable difference between rural and urban areas. Girls of all ages, including young mothers and young women. I have a teenage daughter, for example, but it turns out that mothers still tell their children that the woman's main purpose is to give birth. There is no talk of career fulfillment. There is no such topic as a female career, a female independence and self-sustainability. I was quite impressed by the result that where girls say that you can go to work, but it must not interfere with your responsibility of cooking borscht and picking up the child from school. We also had a dad in a focus group who said, you know, this research made me think about how differently I am bringing up my son and my daughter. I am continuously talking about career with my son, and I never do that with my daughter. And he said he's going to change his model of behavior, and he is going to support his daughter's career aspirations. So we hope that the products that we as the NGO will produce based on this research will broadly help our society change its everyday routine, so to speak. So as to make it so that girls can be exposed to different models of self-fulfillment, so that women become more visible. Because regardless of everything that is being done by the community that has to do with gender equality, this is still insufficient. When we asked, who is an example of a successful woman for you? Can you provide examples? There were no people from the Ukrainian society. Even our celebrities, who are supposed to be relatively well known in the gender equality circle, are not well known to girls in their everyday lives. And there is no clear model of a female leader, a girl leader, so teens do not have role models to aspire to. The good examples are there, but they're not visible enough. So we will be trying to promote this in the media, to promote this in our programs, in our projects, and to develop outputs that will highlight the presence of women. We will be working with local leaders to increase their visibility so that it isn't just rich, famous Kyiv names that you get to hear in the media, but so that the representation increases. And we will be talking about various options of how female leaders develop their careers, of how women develop, how you can be successful in various areas of activity, and the only determining factor is your willingness. In Ukraine, from a legislative point of view, our rights are not limited. The only thing you need to do is be aware of them and use them. All right, I think that will be it in terms of the introduction. I want to mention that simultaneous interpreting is ensured today. If you're watching us online, you need to select your preferred language. If you're joining us here, you can use your headsets, and you feel free to formulate your questions in whatever language you prefer. Right, then over to Lyudmila, please. No, actually, I think let's invite Thais first, because she's here on behalf of ActionAid International, a partner of ours who has supported us financially, and it is owing to their support that we have implemented the quantitative part of the study. I want to mention the partners who have not joined us here today. It's the Ukrainian Women's Front, the organization that supported us during the war and agreed to fund the qualitative segment, which covers the focus groups and the interviews. And thanks to them, it was much easier for us to talk to our international partners. All right, over to you now.
Okay. So thank you, Yulia. I'd like to thank you all for the invite and congratulate the research team on one more amazing work. I just have a few words to say in relation to research in our own work. So this is a very important topic, actually, I believe. So the stigma is a problem that leads to difficulty to access quality information, and it stands in the way of women getting whatever access they need for their health or their own support. Stigma stands in the way of women having the power to care for herself the best way that they can, and make informed decisions in relation to her own body and health. Also, because of what Julia said, women tend to prioritize their family homes, especially in times of hardship like a war or really any other type of humanitarian crisis. So ActionAid works all over the world with local organizations like this chat, bring women and girls together in order to reflect on problems like this that they face and think about the solutions that they can find as well. Crises often aggravate inequalities that are already existing. And even though women are girls, they're often the first responder to crisis, and they're the less likely to participate in decision making, which is a reality that we're all trying to change. Through that, we follow a humanitarian signature that is composed of the principles of accountability to affected communities, shifting the power, women's and youth leadership, sustainability, and resistance. These principles are there to ensure that all humanitarian responses that we make are adequate for local needs, that they're durable, that they empower local communities and organizations, and that they include women and girls who are very frequently left out. In the topic of stigma, here in Ukraine, for example, we have also supported Chata's great work in awareness raising in relation to gender-based violence, which is an important step to break a stigma that can make it very hard for women and girls to speak up when they suffer some type of violence, which is an occurrence that spikes up in situations of war. This research is no doubt one more important step to ensure that this great work towards equality continues to be done. And so I would just like to congratulate girls again and Yulia. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Да, хочу сказати, що...
Yes, thank you very much. And I want to point out that we've been working with ActionAid for over 8 months now, and it is a partner that through everything they do is supporting everything that is formulated in their strategy and their policy. And we are pleased to see ActionAid in Ukraine. We see this as a big opportunity to change behavioral patterns as relates to women and girls in Ukraine. All right, Lyudmila, over to you now. Thank you. Thank you so much. I will only say a few things ahead of the main section of the presentation. I'll be very happy to address questions and comments afterwards. So the study, Women and Stigma, is unique in the sense that as we were performing it, we were developing and testing methodologies for studying taboos and stigma around the topic of reproductive and sexual health of women. But also we were looking at the general gendered nature of female socialization. And the relevance, as you have already heard, doesn't even need to be justified, doesn't even need to be explained, and it fully corresponds to the topics, to the goal of achieving SDGs, the projects and the values that Thais mentioned, the democratic values that we are now defending on all fronts and in all senses. So you will be able to familiarize yourself with the results of the first study, and I share her hope that we will be able to turn this into a regular occurrence, since it is the dynamic of the process and its understanding will give us a full picture of the gender situation in the country that Lidia and Katerina will speak of. Personally, it was a great pleasure for me to cooperate with NGO Girls and to be a consultant to this research, because we share the sociological basis, which is the sociology and psychology faculty of the Kyiv National University of Taras Shevchenko. And I very much hope for continued and fruitful cooperation. And I now pass the floor to my colleagues to talk about the outcomes of the study. Right, so greetings, Lidia Antonyuk here, head of the analytical department of NGO Girls, and with my colleague Katerina, we'll be speaking about the outcomes. But first, Katerina will tell you a little about how we went about the task, what we did, so that you understand where the figures come from.
Про вже показники, які ми отримали.
All right, so talking about the figures that we received, we will share that part with Lida. So as has already been pointed out, the study included two segments, the quantitative and qualitative. At the first stage, we produced the so-called semantics. We generated hypotheses that were then corroborated with data at the second stage. So for our sociologist colleagues, I think they will be interested in looking at the size of the selection we used. At the first stage, we had 36 in-depth interviews and 11 focus group discussions. At the second stage, we involved 2,529 respondents for interviews. So talking about the target audiences, we identified three key target groups. The first group is young girls, teenage girls. The age is between 13 and 17 years. As well as their parents and teachers as two groups that have a significant amount of impact on teenage girls. Right, so we're looking at grades 10 and 11, and then the next, this is an important step in growing up, so we focused on these age groups. Now, as regards parents, we had focus groups with both fathers and mothers. It was very interesting to hold these focus groups with fathers and talk about the gender upbringing of their daughters. It was incredibly interesting, and it was the first time I got to do it. And then thirdly, we had school workers. We had, of course, the girls' mentors, their so-called chief teachers, and we also talked with biology teachers. The names of the subjects are different. Sometimes it's the basics of health. Sometimes the subject is called medical training. Sometimes it's called defense of motherland. But all of these subjects refer to our topics. And then we were also looking at psychologists and social pedagogues at the schools, and we held focus groups with them. At the second stage, we were working with the same audiences, but then quantitatively, we had more of them, 1,000, 1,500, 250. Talking about the quantitative stage, it was both fathers and mothers that we invited to participate. The message we formulated was aimed at parents in general, whoever is involved in bringing up children. And the logic of the questionnaire was built in such a way that it was not just biological parents who could participate, but also caretakers. So even if for the woman, the child is not their biological child, they could still participate. It was fine. But you will see on one of our charts at the quantitative stage, we only had 2% of the participants represented by fathers. So we will, as we get to the outcomes, to the results, I will keep saying mothers. Please remember that it includes a 2% father representation as well. Right. It's also interesting to note that as we were looking for teachers, we did not restrict ourselves. We did not say that it had to be female teachers, but we ended up with a selection of female teachers exclusively, because it seems that male teachers, well, first of all, they're less numerous, and secondly, they did not wish to participate. So the entire selection of teachers are women. Right, and I also want to mention that girls were allowed, as they were polled, if they did not have a biological parent, the way it was formulated is that they were allowed to speak of whichever adult they see as a parental figure, so to speak. So we were trying to take into account all the various realities that we may come across in Ukraine. Actually, I wanted to add, if you have questions, feel free to note them down. I will be following the presentation. We are all sociologists here. We understand what we are talking about. Some things might be very obvious to us, but if you have a question, if something's unclear, feel free to formulate the question. Another thing I want to mention is how we looked for the girls and the parents. For the focus groups, we reached out through our regional recruiters. We had a screener where we tried to take into account various types of girls from various types of families. We were also taking into account those who have relocated, not relocated, those who have moved abroad. We tried to include them as well. And in terms of the quantitative stage, we communicated about the poll through social media to try and cover as large an audience as possible. Considering the audience we were working with, we could rely on social media because they are well represented there. We were also using the resources of our regional recruiters to make it so that our selection is correct, so that it is representative for each of the regions. So it's a mix. We were reaching out through the recruiters, and we were trying to achieve a structure that corresponds to the overall demographic structure of Ukrainian girls. If we speak about regions, we accounted for all of them. In the eastern regions, of course, we were talking to girls who have relocated. And during the quantitative stage, Kherson was liberated by the Ukrainian military, and so we were able to reach out to girls there. Not a great number, but we were able to talk to those who are residing in Kherson. I will not comment on this in too many details, but we have covered all types of settlements, both villages, cities, towns, pretty much everything's reflected. For the teachers, we tried to make sure that the number of schools in each region corresponds to our selection, so that again the data was valid for each of the regions. Right, let's move on. Right, so we planned the selection, the sample, in such a way so that we can analyze each of the target groups separately. So apart from the girls, the parents, and the teachers, we were also interested in seeing the regional characteristics. So we identified 5 macro regions and 4 types of settlement, 3 types of towns, and a village as a separate type of settlement. So in the report, in the extended report, you will also be able to familiarize yourself with differences among each of these groups. The size of the selection allows us to talk of these differences. A couple of more details on the content, the qualitative structure of the selection. So we ran quotas. We had around 200 girls for each group. Also, we subdivided the mothers by the age of the girls. In the qualitative study, we also included the age group of 16 to 18. So we also covered 18-year-olds who are technically adults, but we all understand that they're still children. And for the educational workers at schools, we did not impose any restrictions, and we worked with whatever we got. Right. You have the qualitative breakdown of the teacher population, so to speak. And I've already spoken of the reality that unfortunately only 2% of fathers agreed to participate. Hopefully, in 5 years, in 2027, the representation will be much larger. I will take the initiative to comment. This goes to show who is actually responsible for bringing girls up in the family. Our data is representative, so this is the real picture across the entire Ukrainian society. So when we're talking about fathers' involvement, a male's involvement in the female upbringing, then we see that male involvement is unfortunately very low. All right, so let's have a look at the results. The first big chunk of information has to do with what is discussed at home with girls being present or with girls being aside to the conversation, both what is discussed and what isn't discussed. So we saw a lot of things that actually essentially violated our own little bubble. We tended to think that these topics are better covered, but it turns out they are not. As you can see, based on the results, the most frequent topics of conversations involving girls are menstruation, menstrual hygiene, so physiology and hygiene, essentially. But what I was personally impressed by is that only 37% of girls say that there are conversations about visiting an OB-GYN. For example, women don't feel the need to talk about visiting doctors with girls. But I want to remind you that we are talking about girls 13 and older who need to be seeing OB-GYNs, and girls are afraid to talk to their mothers about OB-GYNs. And so a separate stereotype, a separate pool of perception is around visiting OB-GYNs. And then women, as a result, women miss their regular checkups, and we wonder why that is so. Then sexual health, the big chunk of topics. There are conversations about building relationships with boys, but everything that relates to sexual health, sex in general, unfortunately is underrepresented. Around a quarter to a third of all girls have had some sort of conversation on these topics. And I will separately mention the quality of these conversations, because unfortunately not all of these conversations are positive. Reproductive health, again, unfortunately, there are some conversations about early pregnancy, but other aspects such as planning pregnancy, contraception, abortions, whatever the rhetoric position on that is, over half of all families consider these topics as taboo, and they are not brought up at all. Another thing that I was surprised with was the topic of rape and violence. It would seem that there's so much content on this out in public. There is legislation, but only 30% of girls have had any sort of conversation on these topics at home. And I want to use this opportunity to comment and to add one more thing. We had an open question as to whether girls have experienced gender-based violence, and for 1,000 girls, we had 3 reports of rape that girls never, ever reported to anyone. And that is a separate, painful topic, because the stigma around female health and sexuality leads to cases that should have been reported on, that should have been at least mentioned to the girls nearest and dearest. That does not happen. And so unfortunately, the data that we're discussing here on sexual violence in the context of armed conflict, the data is not there. In an anonymous research, 3 girls in the age between 13 and 17 said that they have been raped, but they have not reported it to anyone. And we suggested to them they could use our psychological assistance. We have a team of 60 psychologists helping women who have suffered from gender-based violence, and the parents do not agree to their daughters receiving psychological assistance, even free of charge, even anonymously, and thus we cannot work with these girls. But this goes to show why this study is important. We need to try and reduce the overall number of cases of violence against women. Right, continuing. So what this chart shows is that this became evident at the focus group discussions as well as during in-depth interviews. Unfortunately, there is no clear understanding and there is no clear continuous gender upbringing in families. Some topics instigate fear. When there are conversations about sexual behavior and sexual health, it usually all bogs down at the level of trying to generate fear, trying to talk about the negative consequences, and there is no continuous gender education. I liked Lyudmila's comment when she said, we are taught to cook from a very early age, but then there is no analog in gender education. When we talk about these things with our mothers, it's not like you're supposed to sit down and immediately have a conversation about sex. But most mothers think that the conversation about sex needs to start with what sex is and how it's done. And they say they cannot talk about that. Yes, very often at our events, mothers say if children are well versed in the male and female physiology, if they know about sex and masturbation, this is us inviting them to have sex. So I want to call out to the parents that information does not equal action. Parents often do not want their children to be exposed to sexual education because they believe that naturally children will go out tomorrow and start having sex, which is not necessarily the case. Right. Another thing, apart from these topics not being raised, not being talked about, another thing we saw at the focus group discussions at the first stage of our research, there is a lot of this metaphorization, use of synonyms. You know, the difference, when we talk about the differences between the female and male physiology, I'm going to give you an extreme example. When a woman talks about physiology with her daughter, she calls the female reproductive organs a little starfish, and the male reproductive organ is then a carrot or whatever. And I would say this harms rather than helps the conversation. So even when a conversation is held, it does not necessarily coincide with our imagination of what that conversation is like. These topics are often discussed with the inherent broadcasting of stereotypes, stigma, with an attempt to create fear and to scare the child. So this is what girls hear about at home, and here is a representation of what girls feel they can ask their parents about at home. So again, they feel relatively free talking about physiology and hygiene, and again, visiting an OB-GYN is the least represented topic, the most taboo topic. For whatever reason, girls feel they should not be bringing the OB-GYN up. And then going up the difficulty of topics, the less the topic is talked on, the less girls are prepared to raise them themselves and to raise them as a question. The same question actually was directed at mothers. We asked them what topics they can discuss with their daughters. They were more optimistic. They believed they could cover more topics. But if you compare the mother's imagination of what they can talk with what they actually talk about, it paints a very bright picture. only menstrual hygiene, pretty much, more or less, is well covered. The other topics, as you can see, are lacking in coverage, and mothers only declare that they can discuss these topics, but they never do. I want to jump in and say that, in fact, the mothers are overestimating their professionalism and qualification in these topics. They believe that they are authoritative enough sources. Unfortunately, when we hold events for parents, participation is usually pretty low. Even when it's free of charge, the parental lectures generate the least amount of interest. So the parents believe that they know enough and they don't need to be educated. And it's thus their poor education that they then reproduce for their children. Right, now, so the big conclusion, the mothers are afraid to say, the daughters are afraid to ask. That's the big conclusion we arrived at. So we asked both the daughters and the mothers as to why they are so scared. We're only representing the results for sexual health, why these topics generate fear, why they are difficult to discuss. The first, both the mothers and daughters report that they don't want to raise a certain topic because it's difficult for them to find the right words, and there is no pre-established practice of discussing these topics. There is no pre-agreed vocabulary. There is no pre-agreed language. It is not a tradition to discuss these topics at home, so the girls are not sure how to approach these topics. Then the second serious reason, the girls are saying that they don't want to look suspicious. If they ask their mother, what is sex? And then the mother will interpret it as in, are you having sex? And at the deep dive interviews, the girls said that my mother might be disappointed, my mother might become sad, she will start asking questions, it will get awkward. I'll rather go Google it, look it up on the internet. Girls are saying that they're feeling awkward about being interested in these topics. That's one of the explanations. And we've had a couple of quotations here from the deep dive interviews. One girl told us she is ashamed of mentioning certain words with her mother. She is afraid that her mother might become suspicious. Now, the mothers, on the other hand, they are also saying it's hard to find the right words, the right vocabulary. At their focus groups, many mothers would say they never had these conversations with their mothers, so they don't know how to approach the topic. There was no sex in the Soviet Union. That's the reality. At the same time, the mothers, and we've highlighted this in red, have reported that they are waiting for the right moment, for an opportune moment. And again, this takes us back to the idea of a comprehensive step-by-step gender education. Most women lack the skills to provide this sort of continuous education. We've selected a couple of quotes here. I want to postpone having this conversation. My child is still small. It's so scary for me that they're actually such an adult. Another response by a mother was, she never asks, I never mention. I'm waiting for her to bring it up. I guess the mothers are waiting for when the girl shows up pregnant and the problem needs to be resolved dramatically. During the focus group discussions, we asked the mothers, where do you draw your information from? Unfortunately, most mothers and fathers that participated in the focus groups, they do not look for additional information. They say, oh, I'm not sure how to approach this topic, but then at the same time, most of the mothers do not increase their capacity, do not develop their understanding, do not look for information that would teach them to raise the topic. So there is no clear understanding that this needs to be done, that neglecting sexual education may lead to negative consequences. Another thing that we identified in the course of the focus group discussions, there was this vision of the female health. Health is treated as something given by nature. So it's like the mother will believe, I have the same physiology as my daughter does, so I can afford not to educate her. I know what I know, I've got my experience, I'm going to share it with her, and that will be enough. So this bias, this belief that your own personal education is going to be sufficient, is harmful. Again, unfortunately, this belief is still there. The mothers seem to believe that they are experts enough, and we will be doing our best, I guess, to re-educate them. Right. So also to form an understanding of, so if we focus now on the mothers that talk to their daughters, some mothers do, we asked both them and their daughters to evaluate to what extent they think it is normal to make certain decisions, to go for an abortion, to give birth to children outside of wedlock, etc. And so on the right, in orange, you have people who have responded, this is perfectly okay. And in sort of maroon on the left, you've got the people who say this is totally not okay. So the highest level of not okay is associated with the decision to go for an abortion. Then there's giving birth to children outside of wedlock, the decision not to take maternity leave, sexual relations outside of wedlock. So again, we didn't formulate these questions ourselves. The sensitivity of these topics was evident during the first stage of the discussions. And then we asked why the girls and the mothers believe that these decisions are unacceptable. Okay, so abortion will lead to infertility, and it's a sin. And that's what women broadcast to their daughters. That's the way these conversations are had. The decision not to go, not to take out maternity leave, a child needs a mother. No one can substitute for a mother. Giving birth to children out of wedlock, the answer was simple. Children must be had in wedlock. That's it. So it's through messages like these that girls are mostly educated on most of these topics. I want to take a moment to comment specifically on the section where we're talking about a child needs a mother, full stop. That is one of the key barriers as to why women and girls do not find professional fulfillment. It's because society makes them believe that it's only the mother who can provide proper education to a child. It is completely the economic reality is disregarded. The specific familial reality is disregarded. I have 2 children that I gave birth to. I never took out maternity leave, but I continuously encounter this stigma that I'm a bad mother who leaves her child with a nanny, and it is unacceptable. But you know, my children never complained, but society is generating pressure, is bullying me essentially for being a working mother. So this barrier of societal societal pressure, it impacts girls who do not have strong ambitions. The girls who are a little unsure, who are a little hesitant, and suddenly they are told, ooh, you're a bad mother if you keep working, that very seriously hinders the involvement of women in the economy, and we'll be trying to work with this. Let me also take the floor here. The sociological community here can seriously contribute to a change in this issue. We can chip in with our experience. I had 2 PhD papers defended, and the PhD student, she went on and joined the armed forces of Ukraine, while the male is actually enjoying his paternity leave. So there we go, not only through studying, but also through our own personal experiences and examples, we can try and turn the picture around. Right, that was a lovely interjection, Lyudmila. Thank you. All right, let's go back to the figures. So we've talked about why. So these are the mother's explanations, and we ask the children, and the picture is pretty much the same, so I'm not going to dwell on this. Now, based on this question on treating different situations, we segmented the we performed cluster analysis technically, but if you talk about it in general terms, this is about segmentation of the women and girls. The questions that we've just discussed and the situations that we had women and girls evaluate, the assessment is pretty broad. You can attribute a value of 1 to 10. The results were pretty broad, and we were trying to segment them in terms of how normal they view abortions, children out of wedlock, sex before marriage, and the decision to file for divorce. And we came up with these segments of girls. There are 4 segments for girls and 5 segments for mothers. So the group without stigma includes those who treat all of these situations as relatively acceptable. Then we go to broad stigma. These are the 17% of the girls, 16% of the mothers. As you can see, there is quite a strong correlation. These are the people who stigmatize essentially all of these situations. And then, depending on the specifics, you have the stigmatization of sexual and reproductive aspects, such as sex out of wedlock. Then there's the abortive stigma. This includes the people who believe that all situations are okay except for abortions. And what's interesting, the mothers have this segment about reproductive stigma, when everything's fine except for the decision to take an abortion and children out of wedlock. Right, so abortions and children out of wedlock are not okay. So among the mothers, this is a separate segment. Among the young girls, this segment is not represented. Perhaps they are not separating this behavior, so it falls somewhere between the categories of abortive and reproductive stigma. So this is the picture that we have right now. These are the types of stigma. These are the types of stereotypes that girls have and their mothers have. So among the girls, and thankfully, the segment free of stigma is much larger, but still, we're talking about the age where their views can still change, and how their views will change, I guess we will see in 2027. Right. I will also briefly mention that we covered all the different regions and all the different types of settlements. So I want to stress the parameters that impact this subdivision. There is a clear correlation, as we saw. With age, there is this situation of indirect impact. And we didn't identify the age of the girls as a separate contributing factor to their worldviews. Well, because the relation between age and their opinions is difficult. But then if you look at the type of settlement, the larger the city, the larger the segment of girls free of stigma, in very simple terms. And then the smaller the settlement, then the higher the stigma, essentially. So the size of the settlement impacts people's opinions. We also looked at the religion in the family and the education of the mother. These are 2 also very strong impacting factors. Less religion, less stigma. More education for the mother, less stigma. It's funny that the father's education doesn't seem to impact the situation at all. Wealth, I mean, the amount of income, doesn't seem to have that much of an impact on girls' and mothers' opinions. So among the girls with lower level income, the stigma is higher, pretty predictably, but we need to look at why that is so, whether it is about the parents having a lack of time to talk to their children, whether they possess more stigma, etc. Yeah, this also has to do with the reality that lower incomes correlate with people living in villages. So essentially, there is more to look at here. And then the family status, whether the parents are officially married or not, it does not seem to have any significant impact on the level of stigma. Now, that was for girls. Now we're looking at the mothers, the age of the mother, the type of settlement, and the region. By the way, the region seems to have a more significant impact here. For the mothers, you can see it very clearly. The regional character of beliefs impacts their opinions, and then the age of the mother. So I first thought it's, you know, the older the mother gets, the less stigma she has, but Lyudmila corrected me. The older the mother is at the moment of childbirth, the less stigmatized her opinions are. A peculiar one. Right, now correlations, again, the education of the mother, the number of children, and the level of income among some of the contributing factors. Right, so we looked at the family in quite a lot of detail. Let's move on to the schools. What takes place in schools? Right, I'll keep going, talking about schools. So, what does the school compensate for? The school completely fills in the blanks on AIDS and HIV. It fills in the blanks on rape and on contraception. So girls learn somewhat more on these topics from schools rather than at home. And I want to turn your attention to the fact that these are the topics that, you know, that civil society is pushing forward. So luckily, finally, schools have programs on anti-violence, on HIV, AIDS. The methodological recommendations are there for educational experts. So girls hear about this more often at school. I want to add, the teachers that we engage with keep saying that families essentially outsource the responsibility to inform on schools, although this is a natural part of family education. So this focus needs to be shifted. If we're talking about comprehensive sexual education, it starts, the main locus of it is at home, and then it's supported by education. But what we hear from teachers is, please arrive, please deliver a lecture on reproductive health, because they're 13, they have their hormones, I don't know what to do, and I get no help from parents. Please help me, because I'm witnessing sexual harassment on a daily basis in 10th grade, and I don't know how I can help them control their urges. So comprehensive sexual education, you know, is meant to start from the age of kindergarten. It goes through the family. It needs to be supported by educational institutions, and it needs to continue throughout a person's life. But in Ukraine, the reality is different. So the teachers who want to change the situation, they are reaching out to organizations such as NGO Girls to help them alleviate the pressure, because they also want to drop the responsibility as the school. And at the same time, they're not experts in this field. They don't see this as their work, but it's essentially being outsourced to them by the parents, and they're looking out for assistance. So all of our projects that include sexual education are quite relevant right now, and we have a continuous line of schools asking us to come, and this is the explanation of why that is so. So what we see highlighted in red are the topics that girls would like to hear more about at school. They say that, yeah, I'm interested in this. I would like to hear about this. Yellow is what they get to hear about at school. The red is what they would like to hear about at school. So they want to hear a lot more than they get to hear. That's the conclusion. We asked about their requests for sexual education and gender education. We also asked about another type of lessons that we mentioned that were mentioned at the qualitative stage of the study to see the general picture. So girls are very much interested in receiving, in taking financial education classes. They're very much interested in this. Then there's sexual education, that's number 2. And if you look at this chart, it seems that most believe that it's rather important, both girls, mothers, and school representatives. They say that the classes are important and they need to be present. As Yulia pointed out, mothers would love it if schools covered this topic completely. At the focus groups, the mothers pretty much formulated it explicitly. They said, yes, they will they will scare them over at school. They'll bring some righteous fear into our children. So the parents would love to outsource this to the school, yes. Also, in terms of ethics and the psychology of family life, this is a name of a class. And at focus groups, the explanations were that what this needs to cover is how to be a good wife, how to treat your husband well, how to iron, how to press, how to cook, how to clean. So as you can see, the demand for sexual education and for the ethics and psychology of family life is pretty much the same. I will comment that at no stage do we single out the LGBTQ plus community. So everything related to the non-traditional way of living is extremely tabooed. The mothers fear to speak of it, but then in our requests we see that our psychologists work a lot with teens from the point of view of self-identification and identifying their gender, perhaps being bisexual, perhaps being lesbian, etc. And essentially children do not have anyone to approach with these questions, and these questions are raised during our lectures always. Children are unsure where they can discuss this issue, and this generates a lot of stress. A lot of suicidal cases have to do with, say, I'm lesbian and my parents will never understand, so I would rather die than have them die. And these are some of the cases that our psychologists get to deal with. So this whole concept of non-standard ways of living and the types of choices that girls or boys make, they have an incredibly strong impact on education. And that is an aspect of stigma that no one discusses. The traditional society keeps saying, oh, why do you keep bringing gays and lesbians into the conversation every time? You keep pushing our children towards becoming gay and lesbian. It's the same case as with sex. If we talk about sex, it doesn't mean that your children will go have sex tomorrow. But there is this false assumption in society. And I want to stress that the responsibility of parents is on them. If their child is, for example, doing self-harm because of this stress, that is the direct result of the education that the parents have contributed to. And this is the result of the education and the stigma that is around in society. So you need to learn to accept the choices that your child is making to avoid having to save them from a very dramatic situation. Right, and then speaking about the formats of sexual education classes, how parents and teachers see this. The teachers say they are not prepared to assume responsibility. They say that it's a familial issue. They see their function as in teaching rather than bringing up. This doesn't translate very well into English. They feel that this is a difficult topic, that schools do not have to tackle. It's a matter of responsibility, that it requires additional knowledge that they don't have, so some sort of external expert should be handling this. And now talking about the formats, so we've highlighted in red, as you can see, there is quite a bit of stigmatized vision. You need to talk about the negative consequences, you need to strike fear, and there should be a lot of theory without specifics, so as not to generate any genuine interest. And based on what teachers talked about in some of their focus groups, we had this extreme example, but I'll mention it to you just to give you an understanding. So a parent invited a woman who had an abortion to a class for this woman to share her experience with the young girls. So the girls are afraid enough. Or we had a teacher who took her class to a museum of tools used to perform abortions. Yes, so the additional traumatization of girls is real. The teacher believed that she did the right thing. Yes, so these cases exist, but at the same time, these girls were never taken to and to an institution to look at children who are left without parental aid. So we do not demonstrate the consequences of what happens when you give birth to a child, but you leave them behind, and it's the state that needs to take care of them. So this balance between scaring girls and, you know, showing the reality of how many neglected children exist while their biological parents are alive, I guess that is more of a balanced approach. So I guess the reduction of societal pressure is important. Right, we've reached Yulia's favorite slides. So a girl is brought up from an early age because a woman must become a mother. I wish you health and a good husband. Everything else will come. So we asked the women and girls what their idea of the key events in a female life are. And I want to turn your attention. I think you see the results. Most mothers and girls believe that professional fulfillment is important, but what's sufficient in their mind is to obtain education and employment. Full stop. That's it. No further career development. That is not necessary. Career success, only 53% of mothers believe it is important, but at the same time, 63 and 64% of mothers believe that marriage and childbirth are important. The girls seem to attribute more importance to career success, 72%, but then based on what we saw at the qualitative and quantitative stages, still this pressure that is generated from an early child, repeating that a woman's function is to give birth to children, it's important. We have not identified any direct reproductive pressure, but still this whole ecosystem is really focused on the reproductive function of the female body. Now, talking about the combination of maternity and work, we had a whole separate block of questions on this. So the first block has to do with you need to manage to live a little before you give birth. So as you can see, childbirth is seen as a very serious bifurcation point, a point of no return, so to speak. What we were pleased to see is that only 22%, so a relatively small portion of mothers and children, believe that it is the mother's responsibility to provide their children with the best. So the father's role suddenly becomes relevant. And Yulia says, but remember that the males don't really participate in upbringing, so it's a bit of a myth. Some women, 33% of mothers, said that life only begins after you give birth to children. but we also understand what that implies. There is some misunderstanding here among the girls and the mothers. I'm going to comment on this slide. So before childbirth, you need to manage to live a little. Mostly young girls are selecting this option, but then the final idea that your life begins after childbirth, that is the preferred answer for mothers. This could be interpreted from the point of view of the second demographic shift, when the average age of childbirth is changing. So the mothers lived in the generation where you gave birth and then you carried on with your life. But the daughter's generation is perhaps of the view that you need to find a solid footing and then proceed to having children. But I want to turn your attention to the fact that neither in the view of girls and mothers, there is no option of harmoniously combining professional development and childbirth. So it's always a dilemma, always a binary choice. So this dilemma of balance is not represented in the public space. There are no positive cases, role models of women who are balancing the two acts successfully. So for us, it's one of the two extremes. It's either a career fiend or a mother. And again, this generates a great fear in women that the moment you give birth, that's your life over. Okay, and now let's move on to the perceptions of success. These are some of our final slides for today. So over half of girls, 64% of girls, said that they do not have positive examples to aspire to. Among those who said that they do, it's nice to see that 32% nominated their own mothers as role models. And actually, if you analyze, you also have you have family members like aunts and sisters, grandmothers. So the female role model is around. But then at the same time, what Yulia brought up at the very beginning is there is no sort of generic example. You have 13% of girls choosing celebrities and bloggers, and the women there are Angelina Jolie and Naomi Campbell. I can deliver a joke. I was listening to the stenograms, and when Angelina Jolie was mentioned, the interviewer asked, "Why do you choose Angelina Jolie?" It's because she's, the ambassador for peace. She's producing great films. But no, the girl said, "No, she's my role model because she's got lots of children." That's it. That's my explanation. Yes, I didn't include the slide here, but this whole demographic situation, the demographic indicators, the existence of a success role model correlates finally with the father's education. So it's more often that girls whose father has a higher education, they usually end up having an example of success. That's the correlation. All right, so the final slide, and then I'll make my conclusion. So talking about success for women, if you look at the responses to the first question, women can be as successful in their careers as men. As you can see, an overwhelming majority agree that it's possible. But there are nuances. Women find it more difficult to find success. Success is not always a source of happiness for women, and the female character is different than the male one. So there are nuances. And finally, a comment on the war, because the war, whether we like it or not. So the qualitative study was run in the summer. The quantitative was run in November and December. What I want to point out is currently the key thing that we were able to see as we were having these conversations with girls and parents. We saw a shift in their attitudes towards security. Many of them explicitly mentioned that there were some restrictions imposed, no staying out late, watch who you're texting to, who you're talking to. So these security measures were implemented in families. Talking about women during war and occupation, these topics are brought up sometimes. During summertime, the girls and the parents mentioned that they comment these situations to girls because whether you like it or not, the information reaches girls, so you need to address it. And certain parents, especially fathers is the right word, yeah, they even spelled out for girls what they should be doing should they find themselves under occupation, that they should not go out into the streets too much. If they go out, they should not be wearing anything bright, that they should try and generate disgust. Certain parents do not address the situation in any way, thinking that there is a risk of traumatization. Again, they're not sure how to talk about the issue. They were trying to protect girls from whatever is happening, to shield them. And there was one case where a girl at an interview, we were having a rather lengthy discussion on this topic, and she mentioned that back in the day I believed that abortion is absolutely unacceptable. It's a sin, but now after the occupation of Kyiv Oblast, I tend to think a little differently because I cannot imagine how to give birth to a child conceived from rape. But that was just one case. It's difficult for us to talk in general about any shifts in gender perceptions in relation to the war. Our data does not reflect that just yet. The war's impact on all of these things is a little delayed. It would not be registered via data yet. Right, and let's have the final slide on screen. I will conclude. So in general, the situation with gender stereotypes, the taboo and stigma around female health and female self-fulfillment is pretty strong. And this study was run not only for purely scientific purposes, based on this data, pretty much based on every slide. You could develop a separate project to improve female access to information, to reduce the strength of stereotypes, to make women more visible. And that is exactly what we are going to be doing. This is only the first iteration of this study. We intend to repeat it every 5 years. And from the point of view of cooperation with the scientific community, I am a PhD myself, and I would really like our students to have access to high quality data. So if any of your students want to develop a master's paper and a PhD paper, so please feel free to reach out to us. The public results are available in both English and Ukrainian on our website. If you are interested in the extended report, it's around 150 pages. If you are interested in that, please feel free to reach out to lida@divchata.org. Just feel free to reach out to Divchata generally. We will find a way to put you in touch with the right person. We encourage all of our partners, of course, to use the data in your work. Since there are international organizations, we've got the representative of UN Women here today, and we are very pleased to hope to see that the data will be usable, but also our local Ukrainian partners will be very happy to share the data with you so that this is not something done in vacuum, so that the work continues. Right, that is it. I would like to invite you to a coffee break.
Do you want to add something? No? Okay. Так що все, я вам дуже
Alrighty then. Thank you so much.
Ні, ми вже обговорили.
Що Людмила не хоче. І якщо у вас є запитання, я
Right, if you have any questions, feel free to bring them over to the coffee break. Thank you so much.